Farming games. What is it about them that makes us yearn for the fields? Maybe it's the desire for a simpler life, to possess true freedom and agency, to break away from life as just another cog in the machine of the modern world and become your own damn machine. Who knows? I'm just here to talk about some video games I played. Now, I'm not talking about games like Farming Simulator 22, I'm talking about the subset of the so-called cozy game genre where you maybe manage your own farm if you can be bothered between your busy schedule of picking up trash and giving it to all the townsfolk. My introduction to the series was Friends of Mineral Town on the Game Boy Advance. From the outside looking in, they appear to be chore simulators, and yet there's something in there that's worth over 500,000 overwhelmingly positive reviews on Steam. Figuring out exactly what that magic element is was my quest this time, so without further ado, the first game I played was the most recent entry in the Harvest Moon series, A Story of Seasons: Pioneers of Olive Town. Alright, I'll make this quick.
But Marvelous Interactive developed the original series, Bokujo Monogatari, in Japan and contracted Natsume to localize and publish it in North America. They were the ones who came up with the name Harvest Moon, but Marvelous later ended their licensing agreement with Natsume, while Natsume still retained the rights to the title Harvest Moon, so they couldn't use it anymore. And then to make it extra confusing, Natsume decided to start releasing their own light farming games under that same moniker, while the original developers Marvelous continued releasing under the new Story of Seasons with Exceed.
Okay, all of that aside, it's your standard fare. You're given an old plot of perfectly arable land for absolutely free, and so you clear the weeds, till the soil, plant the seeds, and then water them until they're all fully grown so you can sell them to buy even more seeds. And having a rather bucolic upbringing myself, I can confirm that all farmers wake up at exactly 6 AM every morning and then power down like a cyborg whenever their chores are done. I'm going to assume that if you clicked on this video, you're at least aware of Stardew Valley, so I'll skip the mechanics and get right to the part where I start complaining. The first thing that jumped out at me were the telltale signs of a terrible PC port, because the menus are a bit of a mess. Sometimes it's E to close them, sometimes it's Enter, sometimes it's a right-click, and above all, it commits the cardinal sin of not having escape back out of any menu. Seriously, I played this for over 20 hours and I was still fumbling with the menus. Regardless, the second thing that jumped out at me was how barren it all feels. The first thing I did was leave my farm and run around to the town to explore, only to realize that that's pretty much it. See those barriers? I'd assumed they'd come down at some point, but nope. Apparently it's part of some DLC I didn't buy on principle. That's everything, so you might as well work on your farm. As usual, your tools start out only barely capable of watering an herb garden, and your primary focus is trying to upgrade them. To do that, you need to go through the random mines conveniently located on your farm and smack rocks until you get enough iron ore to create iron bars. Yeah, there's crafting, and it's honestly a little ironic that it's taking inspiration from Stardew Valley when Stardew Valley took all of its inspiration from the original Harvest Moon games. Crafting and scavenging mechanics appear to be obligado these days, and I'm not against them in concept. It's a bit overdone at this point, but the reason they're so prevalent is simply because they work. I touched on this in my Potion Games video, but it's a relatively cheap but effective way to pace the game and drive engagement into the environment. I think the main distinguishing factor, and why it's so effective at, and let's not mince words here, padding gameplay, is because it's excellent at making compelled behavior feel voluntary. Realistically, compared to hard requirements like kill such-and-so enemies or reach a specific level, scrounging around to the forest floor looking for pine cones is a little more permissive. And that's because, unlike your standard MMO quest to collect 17 walrus bladders or whatever, when you reach some gate asking for 100 pine cones, ostensibly you've been picking them up the whole time because they're used to craft pine cone armor as well, and so picking up a couple more on your way back isn't all that strenuous. Plus, you've already found the perfect place to pick up pine cones. And while you're doing that, you might as well grab some fairy water so you can enchant your disco pants for +1 fabulousness and impress your waifu. But now this analogy is getting away from me, so suffice to say, it allows more freedom. That being said, as more and more of these craft-em-ups appear, it feels like they're just doing what everyone else is doing without first questioning whether it actually solves an engagement problem. Speaking about Poot specifically, the crafting is serviceable. Pretty much everything needs to be processed in these machines that are way too big as they slowly futz along, taking 12 hours to make a single board, so you end up filling your entire farm with them. And from furniture to spice mills, they all look pretty much the same. That must be why they give you so much space on your farm, because Lord knows you'll never fill all this with crops. You'll mainly be using the resources to upgrade your tools, upgrade your house, or repair various structures on your farm, starting with this bridge. As soon as you repair it, you'll be able to go into another cave that contains silver, and you'll be able to find solid logs outside, which will make solid lumber. Then you'll clear away this blockage using all of those resources, and you'll be able to get supple, durable, and mirage logs all at once because presumably they gave up after the third area. You'll also get access to the third mine with gold ore, which you'll once again use to upgrade your tools. However, materials aren't all you need. You'll also need money if you want to upgrade, and that's where the farming comes in. Despite my cynical tone, making your farming tools more effective is sufficiently rewarding to make you want to gather all those resources, and it ties the mechanics together nicely as something to do while your crops are growing. I'll be honest, I wasn't the biggest fan of Poot, but it's a testament to the strength of the format that I wasn't bored to tears despite all of its obvious shortcomings. It's pretty easy to slip into the routine of watering your plants and watching them grow as you think to yourself, soon my melon patch will achieve maturity. Excellent. Exploring that bizarre phenomenon is why I made this video, but I've really got to wonder if this is the best we as a species can accomplish with the concept. My main gripe with the game is definitely how empty it feels, because again, the only two areas are your farm and the town, unless you count these bizarre realms you can teleport to which look embarrassingly barren and have exactly one minigame each. You've got these sprites you get randomly whenever you farm, and you can use them here if you really want to clutter your inventory with weeds that you could just pick up on your own. Seriously, I guess it's because of how central crafting is to the game and because your farm is the only source of these raw materials, but if you clear the entire area, 4 days is all it takes for the whole place to revert back to a wild jungle. Smacking tree sprouts was about as much of a daily routine as tending my fields, and while I don't think requiring daily maintenance is a bad thing, this was definitely pushing it. At some point I just gave up and accepted trees growing between my crafting machines. And is this some sort of glitch? Is this seriously all the room I get for decorating my own house? I'm not even married, so why am I relegated to only this cuck corner? There's also these pools, which if you'll drain, you'll get some garbage in a sack that you can take over to some chick at the museum to identify it for you. One by one. Painfully. It's fitting that these were the original developers, because needing to redo menus instead of having one identify all feature really feels like some early 2000s game design. Eventually you just stop trying to pick them up altogether because you know how much of a pain they are to deal with. Yeah, you'll get something you can maybe donate to the museum, but it's not really worth the effort. And if the player is deliberately avoiding having to engage with the mechanic because of how annoying the menus are, that is what I like to call a design issue. To summarize the quote-unquote plot, you're such a great farmer you awaken the spirits of the land, which happens regardless of how much farming you actually do. Then this woman shows up out of nowhere and just kind of loiters around to this corner of the town forever. That's basically the extent of noteworthy events. As with most of these games, there's special events in town that you can participate in. This was still in the first month of the game, and it was an egg hunting event, so I'm like, great, time to annihilate some children and find all the eggs. But all you get is this cutscene. And then it's over. In the original Harvest Moon games, there were at least some competitions that required you to bring your best dish or your best milk or eggs, and that added to the legitimacy of the farming mechanics. But here, you have nothing. Have I mentioned how barren this game feels? Regardless, another thing I actually like is that the main quest, as it were, is to supply materials to upgrade the town, and you do actually get to see the changes visually affect the town. But the availability of the request is completely fixed. So even if you're an agricultural powerhouse producing 10 kilotons of beans by the end of the first fiscal year, you can't complete more than half of them. I feel like that kind of restriction goes against the philosophy of these games, and I never enjoy feeling like I'm being punished for playing well. As soon as you upgrade your tools and unlock the entirety of your farm, that's your only goal. What else are you gonna do? Talk to the townsfolk? The entire romance aspect of these games has always been one of my biggest complaints, but it really hit me when after entering one of the town events, I proceeded to talk to every single NPC one after another, not because I cared about anything they had to say, but because it would arbitrarily increase a friendship meter that might unlock something later. I don't want it to sound like I wasn't making an effort to engage with the characters. The fact of the matter is that there's nothing there to engage with. I felt more attached to nameless cannon fodder NPCs and shooters than any of these people. I have never understood how I'm meant to care about some massive pixels that regurgitates the same 10 lines of fatuous dialogue each day. Despite that, some people do seem to care, and I can't help but wonder if giving them a visual novel would be like giving pornography to a Victorian. Of course, they're often one and the same, aren't they? Beyond good characters simply taking skill and effort to write, I think it's an issue with the fabric of these games. By nature, they're meant to be played perpetually and at varying paces, permitting various approaches, so the characters need to exist in this timeless limbo independent of any actions the player takes. Which kind of runs contradictory to the entire essence of what makes characters interesting, and that is development, the feeling like they're actually going somewhere, accomplishing something. Instead, what you get are these hollow archetypes. Oh, this is the energetic one, this one likes to play guitar. Oh, this is the nerdy one, you can tell because she stays in the library. It reads like the back of the G.I. Joe boxes where it spells out their military history, because that's exactly what they are. They're dolls for your dollhouse. I'm sure that this isn't much of a revelation for some of you, and I'm not saying that you can't have fun with that, it's just that I can use my imagination anytime I want, and I usually play games because I want to experience someone else's for a change. I never bothered to marry anyone because the game wouldn't let me marry the single mother, and what really sealed my opinion on perceiving these characters as non-entities is when I read the wiki and saw the phrase, "If you divorce your partner, any children you had will be deleted." Divorce is always hardest on the kids. The game included lots of decorations, and I didn't want to feel like I was just ignoring everything simply to be cynical, so I played along and started placing some walkways around, which is painfully slow, by the way. And can I just say, I absolutely hate when games have things like this. Just let me put the tile underneath the bridge. What's the point of decorating if I can't even make it look good? Anyway, after doing all that, I'm rewarded with these stone path and clear away prompts taking up my screen whenever I walk on them. And no, you can't get rid of them. I also wanted to scale up a bit, and this doesn't even use a quarter of the total available space. You can water things automatically with sprinklers, but when it comes to harvesting and planting, you're out of luck. So you end up with this. Literally 8 minutes straight of me walking up and pulling plants out of the ground one by one. It doesn't even have the courtesy to have more than one basic grunt sound effect. For managing these fields, I resorted to entertaining myself by trying to hit the one-frame window where you do the powered-up effect, but with the regular animation instead. These repetitive tasks aren't necessarily a bad thing, because unlike most game genres, except maybe MMOs, losing yourself in the soothing, brainless repetition is most of the appeal, but there's definitely a limit. Some people's are greater than others, but the inflection point seems to be when you go from living in the moment and focused on the task at hand, to wondering when you'll be finished with the task at hand. It didn't help that at this point there's basically no reason to do anything, except maybe repair the hydroponics plant, which takes like months of gathering the rarest resources to get the ability to grow things in any season, that you can already get by unlocking that season's garden at the shrine. After finishing the first year and deciding I'd seen enough, the game stopped me and suddenly revealed this massive submerged ruin. It was deep and required several pumps working several days, so I went coma mode until the whole thing was drained and got some more sacks of garbage that I could already get from whacking the moles in the mines. That was when I stopped playing and resolved to never open it again. In summary, Poot's saccharine setting is achingly bland, the characters are non-entities, and there's very little in the way of content outside of farming. It's not offensively bad, it's just kind of lifeless, but as an aid in exemplifying everything I don't like about these games, it was fantastic. Let this serve as the baseline standard as we move on to the next game I played, Sunhaven. So the first thing about Sunhaven that will jump out to you is well, I'm not entirely sure how to describe it. It's kind of furry, kind of anime. Let's just say that it caters to the predilection of a certain class of internet dwellers. But don't think I'm complaining. Honestly, after Poot, it's a breath of fresh air. I considered making a bald cat boy, but then I realized that I'd need to stare at this thing for the next 40 hours, so I changed my mind. The game starts out with this cutscene of someone who is quite pointedly not you, and then follows her onto this train until she bumps into your character. And is that a typo in the first few lines of this game, or is she trying to say that I'm a particularly honorable human like her? In any case, she sits next to you, and the two of you exchange some light expository dialogue. The character art is a little, I don't want to rag on it too much, because it's still way better than I could do, and it's better than having nothing, but it did put me off a little bit. Also, my character's unblinking stare right into the camera was making me uncomfortable. Well, the lights go out, and oh my, is that a plot hook? I'm actually shocked, because it seems almost unthinkable for one of these games. But yes, there is some semblance of a story going on here. Basically, there's some kind of darkness encroaching upon the city of Sunhaven. And honestly, I appreciate how they're all like, yeah, don't worry about it, and just show you straight to your farm. As is the standard fare, the farm's a bit ramshackle. And if the concept of cleaning up messes is enough to become its own genre, it's no wonder that there's such a mainstay of the light farming sims. There's some part of the human psyche that just wants to clean things up and set things right. So after all that, I waste no time getting down to business. It's a start. The inventory is wondrously large without forcing you to upgrade it like the other games, but it is a little clumsy. You can't just click on something and close your inventory to place it. You first need to drag it to your hotbar, then use it. And with no way to cycle your hotbar, that means 60% of that valuable real estate will be occupied by tools at all times. Anyway, with nothing better to do while my crops grow, I start exploring around the town, and after talking to one of the NPCs, I'm shocked once again when I realize that there's actual dialogue branches. Granted, it's usually just between two choices, but that's still leagues above all the farming sims I've seen. And for the important characters, there's typically a new dialogue branch after each day, and while it's not Hades tier, it is a while before you start running out of new things for them to say. The two options are often broken between polite and rude, and if you say something rude, it'll actually make them angry and reduce your friendship meter, which I respect. Realistically, you'll only ever choose the nice option, unless you literally don't care, in which case why are you playing the game, but because being an ass is an option, it lends more meaning to the polite response. Also, there's this subtle effect where because you actually need to read to determine which one is which, you end up engaging with the text more. Beyond that, some of the characters actually do have utility within the main quest line, and even if it's small, it's enough to make me at least remember who they are, which is more than I could say about the last game. Though, to be fair, as a concept, I guess a wolf boy who lives in the garbage is probably more memorable than a white girl who stands in the museum all day. Although, there's still the mechanic where you foist your garbage onto people until you inexorably become their friends. So you get an apple, you get an apple, everyone gets apples. What's that? Some tyrant is threatening your motherland? That's terrible. Have an apple. Honestly, I've changed my mind. If I knew some guy giving everyone free apples, I'd probably want to be his friend too. I'd be like, hey, it's the apple guy. What the? This guy doesn't like my apples. Well, up yours. You can do quests if you want, and after jumping around town, you realize that there's combat as well. And there's even this massive skill tree, so this game is definitely leaning harder into the RPG elements. How's the combat? Well, it's exactly as complicated as it needs to be for this kind of game, which is to say, not at all. All you can do is swing and maybe avoid an attack by walking the opposite direction if you're lucky. Though I think it serves its purpose as acting as a sort of soft gate to encourage you to upgrade your equipment through engagement with the other mechanics like farming for cash or mining for ores. And to me, that's better than having some hard gate requiring such and so until you can pass, since you can still get through if you're sufficiently determined. So despite its obvious shortcomings, mechanically, I'd say its heart is in the right place. After messing around to the town for a couple days, you'll suddenly be called to the summit by this dragon lion thing, and he's all like, "You have great potential within you," and reveals that I'm the chosen errand boy. So he awakens your latent magical powers and sends you on the main quest line. And you can do them, or just ignore them and continue farming if that's your thing. You'll need to do a lot of running around to complete them, and for that, this little air dash you can do by jumping again in midair completely salvages this game. I remember running around Poot wishing I had that roll dash from Ocarina of Time just so I'd have something to press, and then immediately getting that on the next game felt strange, but reassuring because it instantly made me feel better about needing to run all over creation doing fetch quests, and ultimately proved me right. There's also the Town Hall, and immediately you can tell that this game was crowdfunded because of all the plaques with names no one will ever read, except for today. This one's for you, Jason Roombell. But on a totally unrelated note, here's all my patrons. Anyway, about the farming, it's still got crafting, and the one thing I appreciate is that it's all done in these specific buildings with their own lists of recipes. It's nice because it's a little bit more intuitive to go to the furniture crafting station to make furniture than it is to scan through your entire recipe book like you would in Stardew Valley. And it allows for more recipes without things feeling cluttered. Also, I'll take back all of my complaints about the clunky inventory because of one feature, and that's that these crafting machines automatically pull from any chests on the farm, so no more fumbling with items. Crafting seems to be a good fit for these kinds of games, since it allows the player to extract additional utility from all their roaming, farming, and exploring antics, thus increasing the value of the acts themselves in the player's mind. However, the farming in Sunhaven itself is rather lackluster, which is strange because it's not all that different from any other farming game. You till the soil, plant the seeds, and water them every day until they grow. And yet, when I was playing, I never really felt pressured to expand beyond only a few patches. It's partially because the watering can sucks, and no amount of upgrading it will ever make it water more than one square, but more than that, it feels like in their efforts to give you things to do while your crops are growing, it made them less and less relevant. Between completing quests, picking up random things off the ground, and mining, you'll end up with enough money to buy most everything you need. The profit margins on seeds are actually quite slim, and this game is one of the only ones I've ever seen that doesn't let you go coma mode, so you're forced to run around until at least 6 PM so the game will let you sleep. The days are 20 minutes long, and that means even for crops that take 4 days to grow, you're looking at nearly an hour of real time before you get to harvest them. And by the time you get to harvest something like melons, you've probably forgotten what you've planted in the first place. Because of the limitations of the watering can and how expensive the seeds are, it is quite literally more time effective to pick up all the trash from the beach than it is to farm. While I'm all for the strengthening of activities outside the farm, I don't think that they put enough consideration into how much it was weakening the core mechanic. Something as simple as rebalancing some costs and adding more requirements would be enough, but this brought me to perhaps the most harrowing question, and that is whether mechanical complexity is antithetical to the spirit of comfy games. Because there's lots of ways I could imagine to increase engagement with the farm. Production quotas would be the easiest example, because, like, you're ostensibly meant to be supplying food to the town, but no one seems to mind if you never produce anything. However, quotas means stress, and stress means no comfy. And if some goal requires optimized play to reach, then that means conscious effort that might not be possible for everyone. Just once I'd like to see one of these games incorporate some deeper mechanics like soil condition, overwatering versus underwatering, shade versus light, companion planting, selective breeding, anything. But is that what anyone else wants? Who knows, but I feel like there's already so many of these games that they'll need to innovate something sometime. Anyway, one of the main things you'll be doing while you wait for your crops is mining. Turns out most people who yearn for the fields also yearn for the mines. It's a bit different because unlike most other games, the stones simply have a health bar and upgrading your pickaxe only increases your DPS. I think it does lose some of the satisfaction from the other games when you upgrade to the next tier of pickaxe and can finally smash through the tougher rocks, but it's not a deal breaker. You get deeper by breaking rocks until you find a rusty key, and for some reason you need to unlock this gate through a dialogue first. Then you can't simply walk into the next area, you need to click on this minecart, select the next level, wait for the animation, and then you can resume mining. I feel like this was a solved problem from all the way back to the original SNES title, so it's a bit odd to see it implemented so clumsily. Also, all of the gates you unlocked with rusty keys will re-lock themselves the next day, and the only way to unlock them permanently is to make like 10 keys out of all the ores you've mined in those levels, which takes enough ingots to make an entire set of tools or armor. It's heartbreaking to see all that effort evaporate, so instead of consuming keys, it would have been much better if it required some sort of equipment, because at least then you get to keep the equipment afterwards. Thinking about it, that's pretty much what all the other games do already, so again, this feels like a bit of a regression. Also, this text, "You have unspent skill points." I hate it. I know I have unspent skill points. What if I want to wait until I know what I want to spend them on? But the only way to get rid of it is to spend them. Just opening the skill menu should be enough to clear the message. Well, after finishing some of the main quests, you'll end up discovering access to this hidden elven society, and then they give you another farm. And when I saw this, I audibly sighed because I was barely even using my first one. It had been like 12 hours to reach this point, and not to sound cynical, it didn't feel like it was more, it felt like again. And then after doing even more quests to get away from it, I unlocked this monster city which gave me yet another farm. This time on the rooftops of some apartments. Which honestly is kinda cool, but again, the farming up to this point was pretty weak, so what could have been an exciting feeling felt muted quite a bit. So you've got 3 farms, and each area has its own special currency, but despite that, the farming mechanics are lacking the tools to let you properly manage them. Because not only are there no sprinklers, but there's also these seasonal effects on your crops that you need to clear out manually. So even if you use the special fertilizer that makes it so you only need to water it once, you'll still need to check all 3 farms every day. There's no way to clear these effects automatically, and it seems like such a bizarre design choice, but then I remembered that this game's advertised as multiplayer, so I guess it's so your friends have something to do. Regardless, I can't speak to the quality of the multiplayer because I have no friends, but I can say that it's annoying in single player. As it turns out, there's a way to disable them in the options, as well as pretty much everything else. I've never known how to feel when the developer exposes so much of the difficulty, because suddenly it recontextualizes all my struggles as voluntary rather than an effort to overcome something. Despite my reservations, after turning it off, my enjoyment went up substantially, because it also happened to coincide with unlocking the rain spell. Then my progress was locked behind 2 quests that required me to make actual money in both new locations, and so I felt like I had a reason to farm things at scale. And it was fun! Sometimes I wonder if it's odd that I need some sort of goal to remain motivated, since all these games seem to assume that you enjoy the farming part implicitly, but it's the inverse that seems strange. I suppose decorating your farm can be the implicit goal. Though I've never engaged with it much, I can understand its appeal. It's never driven me in these games, despite being a bit of an aesthete myself. I mean, it's not that I'm not creative or lack the desire. Here's something I built in Terraria like 10 years ago for no other reason than because I wanted to. There was no goal here other than to create something. This personal discrepancy was a bit perplexing, but thinking it through, I think it's the capability to be transformative. In Terraria, I can turn these glowing white blocks and chains into a fluorescent lamp, but in something like Sunhaven or Stardew Valley, a fence is really just a fence. That's my perspective, at least. In any case, it was the first time I felt like all the mechanics were coming together and sucking me into that notorious concept known as the gameplay loop. At risk of sounding too positive, it's fair to mention that this game has its fair share of bugs and bizarre inconsistencies. There was this strange lag that made me miss this jump. There was also the time I got stuck behind this thing. And when I reloaded the game only to find myself locked into this animation. I genuinely couldn't do anything except air dash around, but thankfully swinging another tool broke me out of it. There's dozens more I could mention, but to be fair, at least they weren't game-breaking. Since it actually has a story, I won't spoil the ending and instead talk about the characters some more. It's the first time I've ever actually felt motivated to get married, so that's a pretty high bar for the characters. It's far from what I'd like to see in an ideal world, but considering the competition, Sunhaven stands out as a blazing beacon of character writing. The game does that thing where you're never prompted for your sex and everyone's bisexual, which amuses me because not only is it sensitive to the current cultural zeitgeist, it's also much less work to program, so it's two birds with one stone. Anyway, I went with the Archmage, because what can I say? I like to marry up. Also, she was the only one who absolutely loved the rocks I picked up during all my mining expeditions. Now what? Alright, I guess I'll just leave. I suppose I'm married now. Getting married didn't really change much, and you can't have children either, so it's pretty much the same old routines with some special dialogue mixed in. Also, she became something of a free food dispenser, which isn't totally inaccurate, I guess. Still, my heart yearns for more. She never visited my farm either, which is just as well because she would probably start questioning the pack of werewolves I keep in my backyard. For all my complaints, it might surprise you that on the whole I actually enjoyed Sunhaven. I mean, it's got about a million minor things that annoy me, and it still bears the marks of everything I dislike about this genre, but that's the interesting thing about these games. Despite all its constituent mechanics being quite shallow, it comes together to create an experience greater than the sum of its parts. I mean, look at this. Would you play this game if this was the only gameplay? Conceivably not, and yet I enjoyed it. I've started to realize that the secret ingredient of these games seems to be that it's structured in such a way that results in a series of small goals that the player sets for themselves, while remaining engaging enough to keep your focus, but not so much that it fatigues you mentally. You know that hobby you wanted to pick up, but you set an unrealistic goal for yourself and then blamed yourself when you inevitably failed? Well, it's like that, except you actually took things one step at a time and learned to enjoy the process and appreciate its small victories. My point is, this format seems to apply in real life as well. The challenge from a gameplay standpoint is to set up an appropriate framework that gives the player that feeling of volition while also providing them with enough structure such that they always know what they want to do next. It's a bit of a balancing act, but it's already been done, so all it would take is some more refinement. Moving on, it's game number 3, Traveler's Rest. In this one, you're playing as a tavern keeper who recently bought a tavern. This one's a little light on the farming, but I chose it because I was curious how having a larger, more centralized focus would affect the feelings of the constituent mechanics. Basically, I wanted to know if having a larger goal would make the farming and crafting more engaging. The game starts out showing you how to run the tavern, fulfilling orders, serving up delicious, water, and cleaning up after your disgusting customers. You can add more tables to increase your capacity, plus some decorations, and that's basically it. Then it moves on to explaining the crafting. And first off, I don't know why all these games seem to have wonky inventory management. Maybe I'm just spoiled by Factorio, but when you want to place a building, you can't just hit that number on your toolbar. You need to click it exactly once, and then you can place it. Anyway, I'm not sure I even need to explain the crafting at this point. It does have one quirk where there's special buildings you can place in the radius of a crafting machine to make it more efficient, but that's the limit of its ingenuity. Once you've gotten that down, it starts explaining the cooking process, and the many steps of the brewing process. Once you have your beer, you need to age it first, and so there's not much for you to do except sleep the 2 days until it's done. Then you take your beer, and this tutorial sure is long. It's been over an hour at this point. And despite its length, this one quest to buy a calendar was stuck on my screen because it never told me that this mailbox is where I'm actually supposed to buy things. It also never told me that to get things like butter and chickens, I need to run down here and buy them from this random house that isn't signposted anywhere as an actual store. It didn't help that the door was closed when I first discovered it, so I assumed that the house was decoration and the mailbox was the only place to buy things. So I'm finally free to start experimenting and try to brew my own drinks, and that's something that's strangely appealing to me. There's some part of my psyche that desires to create the ultimate brew, and this sort of brewing and aging mechanic is something I can totally get behind. Especially because it's encouraged by the tavern keeping mechanics, resulting in this great system where two mechanics mutually support one another, which is exactly the type of thing that I'd like to see. Although the real best part of this game is that you can smack unruly customers with your filthy broom. After some time serving customers, I decided I should probably explore around some more, and this world is pretty small when you get down to it. But then there's this cave, and out of nowhere comes this shimmering magic portal, which feels like a complete tonal shift from the rustic life of a tavern keeper. Naturally, you step into the portal, and you're teleported to this ancient shrine, surrounded by rushing water and mighty statues of ancient heroes as the torches burst alight with blue fire, filling your mind with a booming voice. And then it opens a menu where you can unlock new recipes. If Alexander Pope himself rose from the grave, even he would be incapable of penning such exquisite bathos as this. Because apparently you need to commune with the spirits to unlock the mysteries of tomato bread and onion rings. Well, that aside, I do enjoy how you can pick things up off the side of the road and use them as ingredients. Again, because of the main mechanic, they have value, and that makes you want to pick them up. As I've said before, I think these kind of scavenging things are best suited to some form of randomness, because it's not as satisfying to find something if you know it's going to be in the exact same spot 3 days later. Speaking of, all the iron and copper ores just come out of these rocks that refresh every day and give the same number of resources every time. Again, I'm not the biggest fan of this system, because in something like Sunhaven, getting 4 or 5 of the same ores on the same level made me feel excited, while getting 0 made me upset. And yes, games making you upset can actually be beneficial for engagement sometimes. Just ask anyone who plays League of Legends or Elden Ring. However, when it's set up like this, I'm not even given the opportunity to feel anything beyond, just woke up, time to smack the rock again. Routine is an important aspect of these games, but to me, there's a difference between something that you're required to do with 0 variation every day as a matter of course to even play the game, and something that leads to something, so all routines are not equal. To talk about the actual core mechanic of the tavern, it's actually reasonably engaging. It's fairly simplistic, since all you need to do is press E on people to serve them at the bar and pour the specific drinks that each customer asks for, but as I've said, these sort of simplistic yet focused tasks are where this genre thrives. Making different dishes, brewing different alcoholic beverages, and trying to keep your tavern comfortable has great potential as a concept, but I wouldn't phrase it like that if I thought that this game achieved that potential. This game is early access, and while I usually don't talk about unfinished games, it's been 3 years since it was added to Steam, so I'd assumed it would be in a bit more of a final state, but it's incredibly bare bones. There's random chatter from the patrons, but you'll see everything they have to say before the end of the tutorial. They'll complain that your literal water is watered down, and they'll sing that one part of that one Blind Guardian song about 100 times. In an era where anyone can run their own LLM locally and generate thousands of lines of fatuous banter before lunch, it really feels like there should have been more than 10. Which is unfortunate because this is honestly the biggest source of potential that this game has. Yeah, farming, crafting, that's all been done before, but you could make something interesting with this. I'm reminded of a VN called Valhalla, or VA11 Hall A if you prefer, which revolves around bartending and listening to the stories of the patrons. Despite never seeing any of it, you'd slowly get this image of the city and find yourself immersed in the setting purely through word of mouth. It wouldn't need to be quite that deep, but it would give some much needed context to the world, and it would be much more immersive if I wasn't constantly reading the same line 20 times. Even something as simple as uncovering new dialogue would be enough motivation to continue playing, because that is something that this game needs dearly. They could be complaining about the unfair taxes under the Duke of Appleby's, discussing some civil unrest, or their plans once they get to the next town, literally anything. It would help sell the idea that these are actual people with their own lives and stories, and you're only one step in it. If you want to keep it anodyne and comfy, you could have the same guy come in every day talking about his cat, and I would be effing riveted. I'd trudge through hours of tedious table washing just to hear the next installment of the saga of that guy's cat. Because as it is, there's not much motivation to do anything beyond the simple love of bartending and decorating. Maybe that's enough for you, who knows, and I'm not going to say it's unfun, but again, these kinds of repetitive tasks benefit greatly from some greater goal. As it stands, the setting has some vaguely Enlightenment-era aesthetics with some mismatched fantasy elements thrown in. And I'm not sure if this is supposed to be a different race, or colloidal silver is just a popular remedy in this time period. Without any grander narrative, it really needs some kind of mechanic for you to sink your teeth into, and it comes up short there as well. The kind of alcohol you want to brew is almost completely irrelevant. There's like 20 different kinds and they all sell for the same. Conceivably, it's all just for role-playing. You can add extra ingredients to increase its value, but the only thing that affects the price is the value of the ingredients, so the game doesn't really care if you put oranges and mint into an IPA, and neither do any of the customers. The same goes for meals, and as far as I can tell, what the customer orders is totally random, so having something cheap on the menu is actively worse than having nothing because it means they didn't buy the more expensive option. There's no mechanic to attract customers, they simply appear and will fill any and all available seats. There's no budgets or preferences, anyone will buy anything regardless of the cost or ingredients. All customers have identical behaviors, and customers will get angry and complain about the service regardless of how good your service actually was. So forgive me if I say it starts to feel rather monotonous. Which brings me to the grind, and this game does not mess around, because despite the repetitive nature of the gameplay, it expects you to do it a lot. I played for about 18 hours, and this one tavern expansion represents about 8 hours of continuous bartending, yet still not enough to change the floor paneling. Again, maybe I'd feel more motivated if it weren't for the fact that the only result of this is the ability to make more money slightly faster and with different decor. There is the ability to add rooms that you can rent out, but any expansion is so prohibitively expensive and the actual returns on renting so slim that it'll probably be 10 hours before you get a return on your investment. Not to mention that they're significantly more annoying to serve too. This might not be what a developer wants to hear, but does this game even need crafting? You get most everything from the mail order catalogs already, and there's even some crafting machines that you can't make for yourself and you're forced to purchase. Really, all it lets you do is build new tables and aging barrels without paying an entire day's profits for a single bench. It feels like it would have been better if it simply focused on the more unique tavern keeping mechanics without stapling on some vestigial crafting system, but who knows. I think exploration and scavenging could still fit in with it nicely, but it doesn't feel like cutting down trees and smacking rocks every day added very much, at least not with how it's implemented now. This is precisely why I usually avoid early access titles for these videos, but after being on Steam for 3 years, it's probably fair to start judging it. And hopefully it doesn't sound like I'm being cynical for cynicism's sake. This is actually quite close to the exact kind of game I'd like to see, so that ends up amplifying all of its shortcomings for me. The average experience is to probably play it for about 8 hours and leave with a generally positive attitude towards it, which is before the grind and monotony start setting in. Reading some of the reviews, there are some that have played for hundreds of hours, but again, that's probably because they appear to implicitly enjoy the comforting embrace of the grind and the process of upgrading and decorating your tavern. There's nothing wrong with that, but appealing to people who want narrative and people who simply want to zone out is not mutually exclusive. This brings me back to my fears that these games are going to become stagnant because of an unwillingness to take risks outside of the security of the chores and crafting gameplay loops, as well as the overly enthusiastic superfans who will celebrate it simply because you can decorate your backyard. Obviously, this is all only my own perspective, because that's the only one I can give you, but hopefully you can respect that it's at least an informed one. But now it's time for the final game, Roots of Pacha. So for this one, I basically threw a dart for any light farming sim released last year, and there sure were a lot of them. Thankfully, instead of landing on the Disney Princess one, I ended up with the Unga Bunga Caveman game. At first glance, the concept seems interesting, because in most games it's just kind of brushed off that you need to craft all your own equipment by hand instead of buying sprinklers at the hardware store like a normal person. But here, it's the agricultural revolution, so you really do need to make everything yourself. I'll give it 10 bonus points for allowing me to give my caveman a pompadour. This one's also got a bit of a plot and setting, but not as much as Sunhaven. So the village shaman saw visions of a great disaster that would befall your people if you didn't leave your homeland and travel far, far away. Eventually you arrived at the base of an enormous tree, guided by your tribe's guardian spirit, Pacha. Yes, these are the titular roots of Pacha. Pacha's made up, and the game is very serious about telling you that the tribes and peoples depicted in this game are fictional. Anyway, as usual, you start and you're confronted by an enormous trash heap covering the only arable land in the entire world. And this is the thickest coverage I've ever seen in one of these games. Usually it's like half trashed, but every single tile is filled with something. And your only means to tame nature is a sharp rock you found, but it gets the job done. This is prehistoric times, so you need to gather your seeds yourself, which are in the same spots every day and simply need time to grow. As I've mentioned above and in my potions video, I really do think that scavenging mechanics like this greatly benefits from some degree of randomness. Because you know that research with the monkey where if getting the reward was random, it gets even more dopamine than if it was guaranteed? Well, it's probably because of that I feel like these sort of harvest the same thing in the same spot every few days mechanics are a little tiresome. Once you've gotten your seeds, you can start planting them, but clearing out this space, tilling the soil, and watering your seeds is incredibly tiring. Stamina is back with a vengeance, and after playing Sunhaven and Traveler's Rest, I had completely forgotten about it as a mechanic. I didn't talk about it much earlier, because I've got to save some topics for the other games, but it's not something I'm a fan of. Mechanically, it's to limit what you can do and give more legitimacy to the progression, as well as drive engagement into other mechanics such as cooking in order to recover it. but it always seemed strange to me, because there's already limits on what you can do. It's the length of the day. Presumably spending the entire time watering things might not be the most entertaining use of your time, but I think that should be up to the player to decide that for themselves. Obviously you don't want the player to become functionally fixed to the point that they ignore all the other mechanics, but certainly there's a more elegant way to accomplish that beyond setting hard limits of what you can accomplish in one day. Like, you know, upgrading tools. Otherwise, the question is, will the balance of your game be broken if the player is allowed to actually farm in your farming game? And if the answer is yes, maybe change the balance instead of adding an arbitrary limit. Again, with the mechanics stamina strengthens, such as cooking, you simply need to make them useful for something else. Sunhaven's food permanently increased your stats as well as recovered your health. Even in Stardew Valley, stamina was such a non-issue that it might as well have not been implemented in the first place. It felt like it was there simply because the classic Harvest Moon titles had it, so seeing it in such a recent game feels like an atavism. Regardless, stamina is here and you never feel like you have enough of it, especially in the mines, which are more like trials with these spiritual glyptodonts looking over you, as they explain quite plainly that the doors magically open as you prove your strength by smashing rocks. It's not like the mines in any other game made more sense. It's a long way to get here, and once you arrive, you can only smash a handful of rocks before you're completely out of stamina, and that's even assuming it's a rainy day, because otherwise watering your plants exhausts you so much that coming here isn't worth it. If you want to recover your stamina consistently, you'll end up using most everything you harvest, leaving very little to actually contribute, which you do over here, and... Okay, I can't be the only one, right? Like, this isn't just my mind being dirty. I mean, like, I legitimately thought this was some strange reference to a certain aspect of prehistoric art until I came over here at night and was like, oh, they're candles. The developers appear to be American, so maybe they've just never seen one that looks like this. I'm seeing them everywhere now. Moving on. Instead of selling your crops, you contribute them for favor within your tribe, and it's all wrapped up in this nice message of cooperation and unity, because every day you'll see that the rest of your tribe is contributing too. And while your individual work affects it, it's only one part of the whole. You can use your own contribution to ask for favors, and while it's effectively currency, it's an interesting twist fitting for the setting. For the actual farming, one thing I really appreciate is that if you harvest more and more of the same crop, you'll end up increasing your knowledge about it and go from wild plants to domesticated plants. It's purely determined by how many you've harvested, and doesn't include any selective breeding, but the idea is neat, and once again fits the theme. Although it does fill your inventory with 4 different qualities of the same item, and for the longest time I was suffering with the basic inventory because it took me 10 hours to realize that you upgrade your build by talking to this person. I'll give the game the benefit of the doubt and assume that it was mentioned somewhere and I just didn't catch it. The characters aren't bad, and I was at least able to differentiate most of them and remember their faces, which is more than I can say about Poot. Speaking of, it's kind of bizarre that the promo art has this cartoonish style, but the in-game portraits are all more realistic. Well, you might look at these characters and wonder what the difference is between this and a character in, say, Dark Souls. You walk up to them, you get some dialogue, and yet everyone loves Sigmire, so what's the difference? Well, in games like that, you talk to the NPCs because you want to know what their story is, what they do, how they got there. Put simply, you're curious about something. But in games like this, chances are you already know everything about them before you even speak to them. What do? They just live here, same as you. There's no intrigue or momentum to their characters. They're just a literary dead end, a doll for your dollhouse. Furthermore, with Sigmire, your actions can affect whether he lives or dies. Believe it or not, most people who play games are generally good people. And when given the role of a protector, they'll generally take it seriously. It's just human nature. Also, he has gameplay utility outside of simply selling you things. Of course, people love the Resident Evil merchant. I think this topic is becoming a little too broad for the scope of this video. Anyway, I also appreciate how you can just break into dance with anyone, anywhere, anytime. And there's all sorts of activities like races, plus actual events like cave painting. Though I'd feel better if my beautiful paintings appeared anywhere outside this event. There was a lot of thought put into the setting and style, and compared to many things nowadays, it feels like someone somewhere cared. Sometimes that's all I'm looking for, but that only makes it more difficult for me to say that it didn't really grip me. Going back to my assertion that the secret to these games are continuous strings of small self-set goals, this game ended up reinforcing that opinion quite strongly. Because throughout the whole experience, it felt like it was holding my hand far too much and wouldn't just let me go at my own pace. These games are meant to be more casual, so some hand-holding is expected, but it's like teaching someone to ride a bike. Something like Sunhaven puts you on the bike, starts running, and lets you go, but with Roots of Pacha, it's 2 miles down the road and it's still holding the handlebars. The game's central theme is uncovering and inventing new technologies, but the ability to do that is tied directly to the total village prosperity. While you can affect it, your contributions will be negligible, especially in the beginning. Even if you power through the mines and get the resources to upgrade your tools early, you can't actually get the tools until you've reached an arbitrary amount of prosperity. To its credit, the requirements to unlock the technologies aren't tedious, and it's usually only a handful of things, but the fact that you need to wait until some genius comes up with the idea to squeeze tomatoes makes so much of the game feel out of your hands. It's not fun to feel like you're going down someone else's checklist. Yeah, that's basically what all RPGs are, but they usually have drama, conflict, and resolution. My overall enjoyment was something of a shallow parabola, and it went up for the first time when I felt like I was really free to start setting up the farm and expanding it. But slowly sloped down after I reached the limits of that as well, settling on a farm size that was about as big as I could manage to water with my entire stamina bar in the morning. Again, it felt like the game was purposely trying to prevent me from playing the game wrong, even though that this is supposed to be about farming. It was difficult to get the motivation to do anything because it felt like I was in this holding pattern, stuck watering the same number of crops every day and not knowing whether there was some technology to help or how many days I'd need to arbitrarily wait to get it. In most other games, you'll at least have some path in mind to focus your efforts, but fitting with my thesis that the secret ingredient is focused but mindless effort, it felt that every time I'd exhausted my current goals, it was breaking that chain of focus and leaving me aimless. I think there is some value in the message of being reliant on the others in your clan, but it would have benefited greatly from something more conspicuous. There are the caves, and the ultimate goal of completing the tasks on the pyramid, which, credit where credit's due, reinforces the main farming mechanics. But, hopefully it doesn't sound like I'm being inconsistent if I say that it's just not enough. Whenever you want to explore the caves, stamina keeps pumping the brakes, and the pyramid is mostly things that'll happen on their own from simply playing the game rather than focused effort. The caves themselves are completely static, and while I can appreciate a more bespoke design, it adds to the general feeling of ennui that this game draped over me, as upgrading my tools was a matter of taking this whole trip up and around the mountain, walking into the same room to hammer the same rocks to get the handful of obsidian or copper I needed, and then immediately leaving. There is progression, in that you need to upgrade your hammer to get further into the caves, and I do appreciate some paced exploration, so I don't want to make it seem like this game has nothing going for it. Apart from upgrading, to get further, you'll mostly need to pass these trials by reading some of the cave art and determining what items you need to bring to these shrines in order to get their powers. Well, before you can get their powers, you need to pass these trials, which are, well, more of a formality than an actual puzzle. And while it's not terrible to have easy puzzles, when your puzzle also requires these very slow transformation sequences to do any of them, anyone who's already solved it in their heads is just going to become impatient. The powers themselves are only used in this cave and in these very specific spots to cross obstacles, so they're essentially glorified keys. It would be nice if you could use them outside of the caves to expand the rest of the game, but they're quite literally single purpose. Like, what if you could transform into a bear and use your mighty bear claws to till your fields, or your owl powers to fly to some ledge to get somewhere new, or simply fast travel? It feels like it would fit the theme, but then again, the setting seems like it's in this weird in-between state where it wants to remain grounded and at least committed to reality if not married to it, with the shamans and spirits not in a way outside of how you'd imagine people worship them in real life. On the other hand, spirits are real and apparently so normal that at no point does the main character run into the village shouting about how he transformed into a bird and flew over a vast chasm after talking to a bunch of glowing glyptodonts. Maybe I'm nitpicking, but I would have preferred if it committed to either realism or some sort of low fantasy set in the agricultural revolution. This is a difficult one for me, because unlike Potion Permit, I can actually fathom how someone might enjoy this game, but it's just not for me. I don't want to believe it's because playing 3 of these games before fatigued me, seeing as I played several games of Factorio that took over 300 hours each without running out of steam. It might simply be that the mechanics are nothing new and actually lesser than some of its competitors. If this was your first or maybe second entry into the genre, I think you'd get much more out of it, but to someone like me, despite its novel setting, it's more of the same. Which is fine, but considering how many of these games there are now, it feels like capturing that person who's never played one of these games before is becoming less and less likely. Fruits of Pacha's strength is in its unique setting, and it really does get to the roots of farming, pun very much intended. However, it's becoming clear to me that innovating on the setting is merely changing the coat of paint. And much like adding flames to your car doesn't make it drive any faster, changing the style without changing the mechanics underneath won't be enough to rise above any competitors. I wish I could have played more of these games, but they take so long to play and really feel like I've gotten to experience the true texture of them, and I'd rather not compromise on that for pointless quantity. Sometimes I wonder if I'm even the right person to make these criticisms. Being male aside, my preferences are just kind of weird. If it were up to me, I'd make some bizarre high-concept game where you're playing as some depth groveler farming in the belly of this brutalist sci-fi megastructure straight out of Blame, with the goal of appeasing your mighty alien overlords. Or alternatively, conspiring with all the NPCs by winning them over to your side through quests and dialogue trees before making some grand escape. However, that sort of game would appeal to exactly one person: me. And it's difficult to say if my criticisms are objective or simply dragging things towards my incredibly niche preferences. In any case, these light farming sims are here to stay, and despite their stagnation, I think there's still a lot of room for innovation so long as they remain true to the core concepts that make these games so compelling. To reiterate, my main takeaways from this quest are that farming games thrive on that feeling of focused work, and while some people might scoff at the idea of video games simulating real-life work, it's impossible to deny that some people simply enjoy working, especially if they feel like they're getting something out of it and it's reasonably paced with fitting rewards and goals. It feels good to feel like you're working towards accomplishing something and working towards something grander, even if it's simply to decorate your farm and achieve maximum comfy. Additionally, while some people's goals might differ from others, the existence of clear objectives greatly influences how easy it is to slip into the zone and lose yourself to the rituals of farming, watering, mining, or maybe some other mechanic you could think of. Some people might do it just so they can decorate and relax, while others might play just to win, but it's important to appeal to both parties. The game's mechanics need to complement each other so that every task feels like it's a step towards another task so that it creates this unbroken and looping chain of progression where goals are clear and also desirable. Complexity is not necessarily the enemy, it's merely whether or not you can express it in such a way that the average player can understand it and bring it into routine. There's so many of these games, and I'm sure something I haven't played incorporates one or more of these things, but these are simply some of the things I've noticed. As always, I'd like to thank my patrons for indulging me in my bizarre obsessions and self-sabotaging tendencies, like playing 4 games and smashing them all into one video to bring them into some grander narrative instead of making 4 separate videos like a normal person. But regardless, thanks for watching.